The invitation was never meant to be taken seriously. It was written on thick ivory paper, embossed with gold lettering, the kind used for charity galas and power dinners. At the bottom, in elegant cursive, was a name that did not belong there: Ruth Johnson, night shift cleaning staff. Across the city, in a marble-floored mansion glowing with warm lights and quiet arrogance, Claire Whitmore held a glass of champagne and laughed as she signed it. Her friends leaned closer, curious. "The cleaning lady?" one of them asked, amused. Claire smiled, slow and sharp. "Yes, I thought it would be entertaining." She imagined it clearly, Ruth standing awkwardly among CEOs and politicians, not knowing which fork to use, grateful just to be seen. A harmless joke, she told herself, a reminder of place. What Claire didn't know was that Ruth read that invitation alone at 11:47 p.m., sitting on a plastic chair in an empty executive office. The city lights reflected on the glass walls as the vacuum hummed quietly behind her. Ruth read the words twice. Her face didn't change. No smile, no anger, just a long, steady breath. She folded the card carefully and slipped it into her work bag. The night of the gala arrived dressed in silk and confidence. Luxury cars lined the driveway. Laughter spilled into the air. Inside, power shook hands with power, and everyone knew exactly who they were. Claire stood near the entrance, watching guests arrive, waiting. Then the doors opened again. A woman stepped inside, calm, composed, wearing a simple navy dress. No jewelry except a small silver pin at her collar. Her posture was straight, her eyes steady. She didn't look lost. She didn't look grateful. She looked like she belonged somewhere far more serious than this room. Conversation slowed. A few heads turned. Someone frowned, confused. Someone else whispered, "Who is that?" Claire's smile froze for half a second. This wasn't how it was supposed to look. Ruth Johnson walked forward without hesitation, her heels quiet against the marble floor. She met Claire's eyes, not defiantly, not nervously, just evenly. For the first time that evening, Claire felt something shift. Not embarrassment, not guilt. Unease. Because in that moment, standing beneath chandeliers meant to impress, Claire realized she hadn't invited a joke. She had invited a truth. And what they didn't know was that before the night was over, everything they believed about power, class, and dignity was about to collapse quietly and in full view of everyone. Ruth Johnson had learned long ago how to move through spaces without being noticed. Every night after the offices emptied and the elevators fell silent, she arrived with her cart, her keys, and her quiet discipline. The executive floor was always the cleanest: glass walls without fingerprints, desks without dust, floors that reflected ceiling lights like mirrors. She worked there the most, not because she was assigned to it, but because no one complained when she did the job better than expected. People spoke freely around her. They always did. They talked about mergers, layoffs, bonuses, and failures, never lowering their voices, never asking her name. Ruth became fluent in the language of power simply by listening. She understood contracts without signing them, ambition without wearing it. Yet every morning she left before anyone arrived, unseen and unacknowledged. That invisibility was her shield. Ruth wasn't uneducated, she wasn't lost, she was careful. Years earlier, life had taught her that dignity didn't come from demanding attention. It came from choosing when to speak. After losing her husband to a workplace accident that no one took responsibility for, Ruth had learned how systems protect themselves. She learned how truth could be buried under procedure. Survival meant restraint. So she cleaned, she observed, she endured. Across the city, Claire Whitmore lived a very different kind of restraint. Her days were full of appearances: charity luncheons, board dinners, social committees. She was known as gracious, well-spoken, supportive of her husband's success. People admired her elegance. No one questioned her kindness. But Claire carried a quieter frustration. She had married potential. Ethan Whitmore had become powerful after their wedding, not before. As his reputation grew, hers shrank into the background. Board members praised him. Donors asked him questions. Reporters wanted his opinions. Claire smiled through it all, but resentment found other ways out. She had developed a talent for subtle cruelty, the kind that hides behind laughter, the kind that could never be proven. She believed hierarchy existed for a reason, and that maintaining it was simply being realistic. The cleaning staff especially irritated her. Not because they were there, but because they were invisible yet necessary. It unsettled her. Ruth, in particular, drew Claire's attention without meaning to. She had seen her once in the lobby, correcting a security badge mistake with calm authority. No apology, no fear, just clarity. Claire remembered thinking, she doesn't know her place. Ethan Whitmore, the CEO, remained mostly unaware of any of this. He was competent, disciplined, and deeply tired. His days blurred into meetings and decisions that affected thousands of people. At home, he avoided tension. Claire's sharp comments slid past him as background noise. He trusted her judgment. He trusted that her intentions were good. That trust would become his greatest failure. The world they all moved in was polished and unequal, a place where power spoke softly but carried weight, where dignity was often mistaken for submission, and where kindness could be weaponized. So when Claire suggested hosting the annual gala at their home instead of the usual hotel ballroom, everyone praised the idea. When she mentioned inviting someone from the staff to show humility and inclusiveness, no one questioned it. Least of all Ruth. When the invitation arrived, Ruth understood immediately what it was. But she also understood something else, that moments like these were rare. And when they came, they revealed more than they intended. She pressed her uniform neatly that night, not because she felt small, but because she was preparing. Because while everyone else believed the world was fixed exactly as it appeared, Ruth knew better. And soon so would they. The Whitmore estate had never looked so alive. Light spilled from every window, warm and deliberate, casting reflections across the long driveway where black cars arrived one after another. Valets moved with quiet efficiency. Laughter floated through the open doors like something rehearsed. This was not just a party, it was a statement. A declaration of status, generosity, and control. Inside, the air carried soft confidence. Executives greeted senators. Donors shook hands with board members. Compliments passed easily, like currency no one ever ran out of. Every guest knew where they ranked, and every smile was calculated to land exactly where it needed to. Claire Whitmore stood near the center of it all. She wore a pale ivory gown that shimmered without trying too hard, the kind of elegance that whispered money instead of shouting it. A diamond bracelet caught the light each time she lifted her glass. People approached her constantly, thanking her for hosting, praising her taste, calling the night inspiring. She accepted every compliment with practiced grace. But her eyes kept drifting toward the entrance. She was waiting. Ethan Whitmore, her husband, moved through the crowd nearby, listening more than speaking, nodding at conversations he'd had 1,000 times before. His posture was calm, his expression neutral. To everyone else, he was the success story, the self-made executive who had climbed steadily, cleanly, without scandal. To Claire, he was something else entirely. He was the reason she felt unseen. As Ethan paused to greet a donor, Claire leaned toward a small group of women near the bar. Their dresses were expensive, their laughter effortless. One of them glanced toward the door. "So," the woman said casually, "is your special guest coming?" Claire smiled just slightly. She should be here any moment. The word she carried more weight than it should have. Across town, Ruth Johnson stood at the edge of the Whitmore driveway, her hand resting lightly on the strap of her purse. The house rose in front of her like a monument, glass, stone, and confidence stacked neatly together. She could hear the party before she saw it. Music, voices, a rhythm she didn't belong to. She adjusted her jacket once, not out of nerves but habit. Ruth had chosen her outfit carefully. Nothing loud, nothing apologetic. A navy dress that fit well and moved easily. Shoes low enough to walk with certainty. Hair pulled back neatly, revealing a face that had learned to hold its emotions quietly. As she walked toward the entrance, a valet stepped forward, hesitated, then nodded politely. He didn't ask questions, he didn't assume. That alone told her everything. Inside, the first thing Ruth noticed was the sound. Not the music, the voices. Confident, overlapping, unbothered. Conversations that assumed agreement. Laughter that assumed safety. She crossed the threshold, and something subtle shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No one stopped her. No one gasped. But the rhythm of the room faltered just for a second, like a song missing a beat. A man mid-sentence trailed off. A woman near the staircase turned slightly. A waiter slowed his steps. Ruth felt it without looking. She walked forward anyway. Claire saw her then. At first, she didn't recognize her, not the way she expected to. Ruth wasn't nervous. She wasn't overwhelmed. She wasn't shrinking. There was no wide-eyed gratitude, no visible awe. There was only composure. Claire's smile tightened. For a moment, she wondered if there had been a mistake, if perhaps this woman wasn't who she thought. But then Ruth met her eyes, calm and steady, and Claire knew. This was the cleaning lady. The one from the executive floor. The one who never rushed, never apologized too much, never looked down. Claire lifted her glass slightly, signaling to her friends. There she is. Ruth approached at a measured pace, stopping a respectful distance away. She didn't offer her hand. She didn't bow her head. She simply stood. "Mrs. Whitmore," Ruth said evenly. Her voice was warm, controlled, and unafraid. Claire tilted her head, studying her like a curiosity. "Ruth, isn't it? I'm so glad you could make it." A few nearby guests leaned in, pretending not to listen. "I received your invitation," Ruth replied. "Thank you." Claire laughed lightly. "Of course, we believe in inclusion here, don't we?" She glanced around, inviting agreement. Several people smiled uncertainly. One man nodded without conviction. Claire gestured vaguely at the room. "Please make yourself comfortable. Tonight is about bringing worlds together." The pause before worlds was deliberate. Ruth nodded once. "That's kind of you." The exchange was polite, civil, perfectly reasonable on the surface. But underneath it, something sharp moved. As Ruth stepped past her, Claire felt a flicker of irritation. She had expected hesitation, gratitude, something that made the imbalance obvious. Instead, Ruth moved like someone who understood rooms like this. As the night continued, Claire made sure Ruth stayed visible. She introduced her loudly. "This is Ruth. She works nights at Ethan's office, keeps everything spotless." The word spotless landed harder than necessary. Some guests smiled too widely. Others avoided eye contact. Ruth responded with courtesy, answering questions simply. "Where do you live? How long have you worked there? Do you enjoy it?" "Yes. A while. It pays the bills." Each answer was calm, closed, unembellished. Claire watched closely, waiting for the crack. She guided Ruth toward a cluster of senior executives. "Ruth here sees the building from a very different angle than we do," she said brightly. "I thought it would be educational." One man chuckled awkwardly. Another shifted his weight. "And tell me," Claire continued, voice smooth, "what's it like cleaning offices most people will never step foot in?" The question hovered, heavy with intention. Ruth paused, just long enough to feel deliberate. "It's quiet," she said. "You learn a lot when people don't realize you're listening." A few heads turned. Claire's eyes narrowed slightly. "Oh, like what?" Ruth met her gaze again. "Like who feels secure enough to speak honestly and who doesn't." The silence that followed was thin, stretched. Someone cleared their throat. Ethan, standing across the room, finally noticed the tension. He excused himself and approached, concern knitting his brow. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Perfect," Claire replied quickly. "I was just showing Ruth around." Ethan extended a hand, polite but distracted. "Nice to meet you." Ruth shook it firmly. "Likewise." Something about her grip, her presence, made Ethan look twice. Claire felt it, the shift she hadn't planned for. She smiled again, sharper this time. "I was just asking Ruth how it feels to work so close to success every day." Ethan frowned. "Claire." "How it feels," Claire continued, ignoring him, "to clean spaces you'll never really belong to." The words were soft, measured, but they landed like a slap. The room went still. All eyes turned toward Ruth. And for the first time that night, the joke stopped being funny. Ruth inhaled slowly. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't bristle. She simply looked at Claire, then at Ethan, then at the people watching. And she said, "Would you like an honest answer?" The question hung there, daring anyone to stop her. No one did. And that was when the night truly began to change. The room didn't breathe. Ruth's question, "Would you like an honest answer?" settled into the space between crystal glasses and polished smiles, heavier than any accusation. No one interrupted. No one laughed. Even the music felt distant now, like it belonged to another house entirely. Claire held her smile, but it had lost its ease. This wasn't the script. The cleaning lady wasn't supposed to take control of the moment. Yes, Claire said lightly, though her jaw tightened. Of course, honesty is always refreshing. Ethan shifted beside her. Claire, maybe this is. It's fine, she cut in, never taking her eyes off Ruth. I'm curious. Ruth nodded once. It feels educational, she began. Her tone was even thoughtful. You learn how people measure themselves by titles, by access, by who they think is watching. A murmur rippled through the nearby guests. Ruth continued, unhurried. You also learn how much people say when they believe no one important is listening. Claire laughed softly. Well, that's certainly one way to look at it. Ruth turned slightly, including the room now, not just Claire. It teaches you the difference between power and security. The word security landed strangely. A few people exchanged looks. One executive lowered his glass. Ethan studied Ruth more closely. There was no bitterness in her voice, no anger, just precision. And what's the difference? Claire asked. Ruth met her gaze again. Power needs to be proven, security doesn't. The silence sharpened. Claire's fingers tightened around her glass. She hadn't expected restraint. She'd expected gratitude or embarrassment or at least defensiveness, not this quiet authority that made people listen without demanding it. Well, Claire said after a moment, you certainly sound confident. Ruth gave a small, polite smile. Confidence comes from knowing yourself, not from where you're invited. That was when the room truly turned. Not dramatically, not loudly, but subtly, the way tides shift before anyone notices the water has moved. A woman near the bar nodded to herself. A man frowned, thoughtful. Someone whispered Ruth's name again, this time without mockery. Claire felt eyes on her now. She straightened. I only meant to offer you an experience you wouldn't normally have, she said, voice a shade sharper. Exposure can be valuable. Exposure cuts both ways, Ruth replied. Ethan cleared his throat. Ruth, thank you for coming, I appreciate. I came because I was invited, Ruth said gently, turning to him. Nothing more, nothing less. Her respect toward Ethan only made the contrast sharper. Claire felt heat rise in her chest. She had meant to control this moment. Instead, she was standing inside it bare. She gestured toward a nearby table. Why don't you sit, have some food, enjoy the night? The dismissal was obvious. Ruth glanced at the table, then back at Claire. I will, she said, for a little while. She moved away calmly, leaving a pocket of unease behind her. Claire exhaled, forcing a laugh. Well, that was unexpected. A few guests smiled weakly. No one joined her laughter. Ethan leaned closer. What was that about? Nothing, Claire said quickly, just making conversation. But Ethan wasn't convinced. He watched Ruth as she took a seat near the edge of the room, accepting a glass of water from a waiter with a nod of thanks. She didn't retreat into herself. She observed, always observing. Minutes passed. Conversations resumed, but they were quieter now, more cautious. Claire felt it slipping. The room wasn't revolving around her anymore. She decided to press. She crossed the floor deliberately, stopping near Ruth's table. I was telling some friends, she said loudly enough to draw attention, how admirable it is that you've stayed in the same role for so long. Loyalty is rare these days. Ruth looked up. Stability matters. Of course, Claire replied. Some people are meant to build, others are meant to maintain. The implication hung openly now. Ruth considered her for a moment, then she stood. Slowly, purposefully. I agree, she said. Maintenance is undervalued until something breaks. A few people inhaled sharply. Claire scoffed. Are you suggesting something's broken here? Ruth looked around the room, the chandeliers, the polished floors, the carefully curated generosity. Then she looked back at Claire. I think, she said calmly, that when people use kindness as entertainment, something already has. Ethan stepped forward. Claire, that's enough. She turned on him. Why are you defending her? I'm not, he said. I'm asking you to stop. The room watched, silent witnesses to a fracture that could no longer be hidden. Claire felt exposed, not because of Ruth, but because the mask was slipping in front of people who mattered. She straightened again, pride hardening her voice. This was supposed to be a gesture of goodwill, she said. If it's being misunderstood, It isn't, Ruth interrupted quietly. The interruption was gentle, but final. Ruth took a breath. You invited me here to be seen, so I'm letting myself be seen, that's all. A man near the staircase spoke up hesitantly. Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps we should. Claire shot him a look. This is my home. Ruth nodded, and tonight it's your mirror. The words didn't accuse, they reflected. The room felt smaller now, closer, as if the walls had leaned in. Ethan looked at his wife, really looked at her, and something shifted behind his eyes, recognition, maybe regret. Claire felt it, and for the first time she was afraid. Not of Ruth, of what was becoming undeniable. Ruth picked up her purse, preparing to leave. Thank you for the invitation, she said calmly. I believe I've learned what I needed. Claire opened her mouth to reclaim control to say something sharp, but nothing came. As Ruth walked toward the exit, conversations didn't resume. Eyes followed her, not with pity, but with something closer to respect. At the door, Ruth paused. She turned back once, just long enough to say, some rooms reveal who belongs, others reveal who pretends. Then she left. And behind her, in a house built on appearances, the illusion cracked, not loudly, not violently, but enough that everyone inside felt it. The confrontation was over. The consequences were just beginning. Ruth Johnson's departure did not end the night. It cracked it open. For several seconds after the front door closed behind her, no one moved. The soft hum of conversation that had defined the evening refused to return, as if the house itself had decided to hold its breath. Glasses were lifted and set back down untouched. Smiles hovered, unsure where to land. Claire Whitmore stood frozen near the center of the room. She told herself she was angry. That was the easier feeling. Anger had edges, direction. It could be justified, defended. But beneath it, something else stirred, something far more uncomfortable. Exposure. She felt it in the way people avoided her eyes now. In the way conversations restarted without her at the center. In the way a few guests glanced toward the door Ruth had exited through, as if measuring what they had just witnessed. Claire laughed suddenly, a little too loud. Well, she said, clapping her hands once, that was dramatic. The sound echoed awkwardly. No one joined in. Ethan remained silent beside her, his expression unreadable. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was processing. That worried her more. Across the room, small clusters began to form. People leaned toward each other, voices low, cautious. Did you hear that last line? She didn't raise her voice once. That wasn't what I expected at all. The word expected surfaced again and again, spoken with quiet discomfort. Claire sensed control slipping further. She excused herself abruptly and walked toward the bar, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. A server stepped aside too quickly, startled. She poured herself another drink, hands slightly unsteady. This was not how power worked. Power wasn't supposed to feel questioned. It wasn't supposed to linger in silence and glance sideways. She glanced toward Ethan. He was standing near a group of board members, but he wasn't speaking. He was listening, really listening, to something one of them was saying. His posture was tense, shoulders squared in a way she recognized. It was the posture he had when a deal went wrong. Claire approached, forcing calm into her stride. I'm just saying, one of the men was murmuring. There are ways to show generosity without turning it into a spectacle. Ethan nodded slowly. I agree. Claire stepped in. Agree with what? The man stiffened slightly. Nothing important. But Ethan didn't look at her. His gaze drifted toward the front of the house again, toward the space Ruth had occupied. She wasn't wrong, he said quietly. Claire blinked. About what? About listening, he replied. About how people talk when they think no one's paying attention. Claire scoffed. She twisted your words. That's what people do when they feel insecure. Ethan finally turned to her. Did she? There was no accusation in his tone, just curiosity. That hurt more than anger would have. Meanwhile, Ruth walked down the long driveway alone, the night air cool against her skin. Each step felt heavier than the last, not with regret, but with release. She had said what she came to say, not everything, not yet, but enough to disrupt the lie. At the gate, she paused briefly, placing a hand over her chest as she steadied her breathing. She hadn't planned to stay long, she never had. Still, walking away didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing at the edge of something unfinished. A security guard opened the gate for her. "Have a good evening, ma'am," he said respectfully. Ruth nodded. "You too." As she walked toward the street, headlights slowed. A familiar voice called her name. "Ms. Johnson." She turned. One of the board members, a woman in her late 50s, composed, sharp-eyed, hurried toward her. She had watched the entire exchange earlier without intervening. "I just wanted to say," the woman said, lowering her voice, "that took courage." Ruth met her gaze. It took honesty. The woman nodded. "If you're ever interested in other opportunities, I'd like to talk." Ruth didn't smile. She didn't agree. She simply said, "I'll consider it." The car door closed behind her, and Ruth disappeared into the night, but her presence remained. Back inside the Whitmore estate, the party continued in name only. Claire felt it everywhere, in the delayed responses, in the polite distance, in the way people now addressed Ethan directly, bypassing her. She tried to reclaim control the only way she knew how, by reframing. "I think people forget," she said to a small group near the fireplace, "that kindness doesn't always land the way it's intended." A woman responded carefully, "Intent matters, Claire, but so does impact." The words struck harder than expected. Across the room, Ethan excused himself from conversation and stepped into his study, closing the door behind him. He needed quiet, real quiet, the kind that let thoughts rise without interruption. He leaned against the desk, replaying the night in fragments. Ruth's steady voice. Claire's calculated smiles. The way the room had shifted. He realized something unsettling. This wasn't the first time Claire had spoken like that. It was simply the first time someone had refused to absorb it silently. He had mistaken silence for consent. That realization settled heavy in his chest. Claire noticed his absence and followed moments later, pushing the study door open without knocking. "Why are you acting like this?" she demanded. "She embarrassed me." Ethan looked up slowly. "You embarrassed yourself." The words were calm, measured. They landed harder than shouting ever could. Claire stared at him. "You're taking her side." "I'm taking the truth seriously," he replied. "That's different." "She's staff, Ethan. She's a person." The correction was simple, devastating. Claire laughed bitterly. "So now I'm the villain." "No," Ethan said, "but you're not the victim." The silence between them thickened, filled with years of things unsaid. Outside the study, guests began quietly making excuses to leave. The night had lost its shine. The spectacle was over. Claire stood alone in the center of the room once more. But this time, no one was watching her with admiration. Only memory. And far away, in a small apartment overlooking the city, Ruth sat on the edge of her bed, invitation card laid flat on the table in front of her. She looked at it one last time. Then she folded it slowly and placed it in the trash. Not because it no longer mattered, but because what came next would. Morning arrived without ceremony. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the Whitmore estate, revealing what the night had hidden: half-empty glasses, chairs slightly out of place, the faint residue of an event that had ended wrong. The house felt quieter than usual, not peaceful, but unsettled, like a question left unanswered. Claire Whitmore woke with a dull ache behind her eyes. For a few seconds she lay still, convincing herself the discomfort was from the wine, the long night, the stress of hosting. Then memory returned, not in fragments, but whole and unforgiving. Ruth's voice. The silence of the room. Ethan's words, "You embarrassed yourself." Claire sat up sharply. She moved through the house with restless energy, replaying conversations, reframing them in her mind. She told herself Ruth had been manipulative, that the guests had overreacted, that Ethan would calm down once the embarrassment faded. But the phone on the kitchen counter didn't ring. Not once. Usually by this hour there would be messages, thank yous, compliments, follow-ups. Today there was nothing. The silence felt intentional. At Whitmore Industries, the mood was no different. Ethan arrived early, but the building felt heavier than usual. Employees greeted him politely, yet something in their eyes had shifted, not disrespect, but awareness. News traveled fast in spaces where people were used to being invisible. By mid-morning, he received 3 emails from board members requesting private conversations. The wording was careful, professional, but the implication was clear. The gala had consequences. During one meeting, a senior partner cleared his throat and said, "We need to be mindful of how company culture reflects leadership." Ethan nodded, "I agree." Last night raised questions. "I know," Ethan replied, "and I intend to address them." Across the city, Ruth Johnson resumed her routine. She arrived at the office building before dawn, uniform pressed, hair neatly pulled back. The lobby was quiet, the marble floors cool beneath her shoes. Everything looked the same, and yet nothing did. People noticed her now. Not in the way Claire had wanted, not as a spectacle, but with curiosity, with respect, with something approaching caution. A junior analyst nodded at her. A security guard greeted her by name. On the executive floor, Ruth paused briefly outside the glass-walled conference room. Inside, a group of managers spoke in lowered voices. One of them glanced up and stopped talking when he saw her. Ruth met his eyes calmly and continued past. She wasn't imagining it. The atmosphere had changed. Later that day, her supervisor pulled her aside. "You've been mentioned," he said carefully. Ruth waited. "In a good way," he added quickly. "Someone from the board asked about you." She nodded once, "I see." At home that evening, Ethan and Claire sat at opposite ends of the dining table. The space between them felt wider than the table itself. "You didn't say anything at breakfast," Claire finally said. "I didn't have anything polite to say," Ethan replied. Claire's jaw tightened, "So now politeness matters." "Yes," he said, "especially when power is involved." She scoffed, "You're letting one moment rewrite everything." "It wasn't one moment," Ethan said quietly. "It was one moment we couldn't ignore anymore." Claire stood pacing. "She humiliated me." "She exposed you," Ethan corrected. "There's a difference." The words landed heavily. "That woman knew exactly what she was doing," Claire snapped. "She played the room." "No," Ethan said. "She told the truth in a room that wasn't used to hearing it." Claire stopped pacing. "So what? You're going to apologize to her now?" Ethan looked at her steadily. "Yes." Her laugh was sharp. "You can't be serious." "I am." "You'd choose her over me." "I'm choosing accountability," he said. "If you see that as choosing her, that's something you need to examine." The argument ended not with shouting, but with exhaustion. Days passed. The story spread quietly, not as gossip, but as lesson. People spoke about the gala in careful tones, emphasizing Ruth's composure, the tension, the way the room had turned. Claire felt herself becoming a cautionary example. Invitations slowed. Committees postponed meetings. People who once laughed easily around her now measured their words. She blamed Ruth for all of it. Meanwhile, Ruth received an email. A formal request for a meeting, board level, discreet. She read it twice, then closed her laptop. That night, she stood by her window, city lights blinking below, thinking of her husband, of promises made and broken, of all the times she had stayed silent because silence felt safer. This time, she chose differently. At the meeting, Ruth sat across from 3 executives, including the woman who had spoken to her outside the gala. They didn't patronize her. They didn't apologize excessively. They listened. "You changed the tone of that room," one of them said, "without trying to." Ruth folded her hands. "I spoke honestly." "And honesty has value," the woman replied, "especially in places that forget it." They discussed options, not charity, not favors, but pathways. Roles that recognized her insight, her experience, her restraint. Ruth didn't agree to anything yet. Back at the Whitmore estate, Claire stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. For the first time, she didn't recognize the woman looking back. She had always believed power protected her. Now she understood something else had always been watching. And somewhere between dignity and consequence, the balance was shifting, slowly, inevitably, toward a truth no one could clean away. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. No press, no announcements, no spectacle, just a quiet line on Ethan Whitmore's calendar marked internal review, culture, and accountability. That alone made people nervous. Ruth Johnson arrived 10 minutes early. She wore the same kind of composure she always did, nothing ornamental, nothing defensive. The conference room was familiar to her in a way it wasn't to the executives seated around the table. She had cleaned it hundreds of times. She knew where people sat when they felt powerful. She knew which chairs were avoided. She knew how sound carried in the corners. Today, she sat at the table. Not as staff, not as a guest, but as a voice. Ethan entered last. He paused when he saw her, not out of surprise but recognition. He nodded respectfully and took his seat. The door closed. The room sealed itself off from pretense. One of the board members cleared her throat. "We're here because what happened at the gala revealed something we can't ignore anymore." No one interrupted. "For years," she continued, "we've talked about values, about dignity, about leadership. And then one night showed us how easily those words collapse when they're tested." Her eyes moved, not accusingly, but honestly, toward Claire Whitmore, seated at the far end of the table. Claire had insisted on attending. She sat upright, arms crossed lightly, face composed. She had spent days rehearsing explanations, soft apologies, strategic humility. She believed she could still control the narrative. She believed wrong. "This is not a disciplinary hearing," the board member said. "It's a reckoning." The word landed with weight. Another executive spoke. "Ruth Johnson is here because she experienced something firsthand, something that reflects how power is exercised in our orbit." Claire inhaled sharply. "This is unnecessary, I already explained." Ethan raised a hand. "Let her speak." The room went still. Ruth didn't rush. She looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes once, not seeking approval, establishing presence. "I didn't come here to accuse anyone," she began. "I came because I was asked to tell the truth." Her voice was steady, unembellished. "At the gala, I was invited under the appearance of kindness, but the intention wasn't inclusion, it was exposure." Claire scoffed softly. "That's your interpretation." Ruth turned to her calmly. "It's my experience." Silence followed. Ruth continued. "I've worked in this building for 11 years. I've cleaned offices after layoffs were discussed like numbers. I've heard jokes about people who never knew they were being laughed at." She paused. "I stayed silent because silence kept me employed." The honesty unsettled the room. "But that night," Ruth said, "silence would have made me complicit in my own humiliation." Claire leaned forward. "So you humiliated me instead." Ruth didn't react. "I spoke. If that felt like humiliation, perhaps it's because the words landed where intention was hidden." Ethan's jaw tightened. One board member nodded slowly. Another took notes. "This isn't about one comment," Ruth added. "It's about a pattern. When people believe kindness gives them permission to demean, something is already broken." Claire stood abruptly. "This is outrageous. You're turning a misunderstanding into a character attack." Ethan stood too. "No," he said firmly. "She's naming something we ignored." Claire turned on him. "You're siding with her because you feel guilty." "I'm siding with accountability," Ethan replied, "because leadership doesn't stop at the office door." The room felt charged now, not angry but exposed. The board chair spoke again. "Claire, this conversation isn't about punishment, it's about responsibility." Claire laughed bitterly. "So what? You're all going to pretend you've never benefited from hierarchy." No one denied it. "That's exactly why this matters," the chair said. "We benefit, which means we have to listen when someone tells us how that power feels from below." Ruth folded her hands. "I don't want sympathy," she said quietly. "I want acknowledgement." She turned to Claire. "You didn't see me as a person that night, you saw me as a prop." The word hung heavy. Claire's composure cracked just slightly. "That's not true," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Then say my name," Ruth replied. Claire hesitated. The pause was short, but it said everything. "Ruth," she finally said. Ruth nodded once. "Thank you." The room exhaled. Ethan spoke next, his voice lower, steadier than anyone had heard it in months. "I enabled this, by not questioning it, by assuming good intentions were enough." He looked at Ruth. "I'm sorry." The apology wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. It was real. Ruth acknowledged it with a slight nod. The board chair leaned forward. Ruth, we'd like to formally offer you a role, advisory, internal, cultural oversight with authority. Claire stiffened. You're rewarding her for attacking me. No, the chair replied calmly. We're recognizing insight we failed to value. Ruth took a breath. I'll accept, she said, on one condition. The room leaned in. That this role is not symbolic, that when I speak, I'm heard, and that when behavior crosses lines, consequences follow regardless of who they belong to. Ethan nodded immediately, agreed. The board followed. All eyes turned to Claire. This changes things, she said quietly. Yes, the chair replied, it does. The decision wasn't shouted, no one applauded. But the shift was unmistakable. Claire left the meeting early. She walked out of the building she once felt untouchable in, heels echoing through halls that suddenly felt colder. People watched her pass, not with judgment, but with awareness. For the first time, she understood what Ruth had lived with daily. Invisibility. That evening, Ethan returned home alone. He stood in the empty living room, the memory of the gala replaying in reverse. The laughter, the chandeliers, the moment everything fractured. He knew what he had lost, and what he could no longer protect. Across the city, Ruth stood at her window again, the city humming below. Her phone buzzed with a message from the board chair. Welcome, we're glad you spoke. Ruth set the phone down. She didn't smile. She simply closed her eyes, not in relief, but in resolve. Because the truth had finally been heard. And once heard, it could not be unlearned. The building learned a new rhythm. It wasn't loud, it wasn't announced. It arrived the way real change often does, quietly, through altered habits and different silences. Meetings began on time and ended with clearer questions. Conversations shifted from who spoke the longest to who listened the best. People noticed who was in the room and who wasn't with a new kind of attention. Ruth Johnson's first week in her new role was deliberately uneventful. She refused an office with glass walls, chose instead a smaller space near the operations floor where foot traffic was constant and conversations were less polished. She wanted to hear what people said when they weren't performing. She wanted proximity to reality. Some executives were cautious around her at first. They spoke carefully as if unsure where the boundaries were. Ruth didn't correct them. She observed. She let discomfort reveal its own lessons. When she spoke, it was never long, never dramatic. But it was precise. Who isn't being consulted here? What happens if we slow this decision down? Who absorbs the consequences if this goes wrong? Those questions lingered. People began to adjust, not because they were afraid of her, but because ignoring her felt dishonest. Ethan Whitmore watched the shift with a mixture of relief and regret. He found himself staying later, not to control outcomes, but to understand processes he had once delegated without question. He invited feedback without defending himself. It was harder than strategy meetings, harder than negotiations. One evening, he stopped by Ruth's office doorway. "May I?" he asked. She nodded. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "not just for speaking, but for staying." Ruth considered him for a moment. "Change doesn't happen in exits," she replied. "It happens in follow-through." He smiled faintly. "I'm learning that." At home, the Whitmore estate felt emptier, not because rooms were vacant, but because something essential had left. Claire moved through the house like a visitor. The staff remained professional, but something had shifted in their posture. They were no longer cautious. They were simply neutral. She noticed. The first few days after the meeting, Claire told herself this was temporary. That Ethan would come around. That people would forget. They didn't. Invitations dried up. Committees paused. Friends she had once hosted stopped returning calls promptly. When she did appear in social spaces, conversations stayed polite and shallow. For the first time, no one needed her approval. She tried to explain herself carefully, selectively, but explanations sounded thin without the audience she once had. One afternoon, she stood alone in the same living room where the gala had unfolded, sunlight hitting the spot where Ruth had stood. She remembered the confidence, the restraint, the way the room had bent without being forced. It unsettled her still. Ethan asked for space. Not dramatically, not angrily. "I need to figure out who I am without excusing who you are," he said. Claire didn't argue. For once, she didn't know how. Weeks passed. Ruth returned to the cleaning schedule one evening, not to work, but to say goodbye to people she had known for years. The custodial team gathered around her quietly, unsure how to speak to someone who had crossed a boundary few ever did. "You don't belong here anymore," one man said with a half-smile. Ruth shook her head gently. "I belonged here before, that's the difference." She hugged them each in turn. That night she walked the executive floor one last time, not as staff, but as witness. She paused at the glass wall overlooking the city, the same spot where she had once read an invitation meant as a joke. She stood there for a long moment. Then she turned off the light and closed the door behind her. Change reached beyond the building. Word traveled not as scandal, but as example. Other companies reached out. Panels invited Ruth to speak, not about herself, but about systems. She declined most of them. Visibility, she knew, could become another kind of trap. Instead, she focused on the work, slow, deliberate shifts that wouldn't make headlines but would make rooms safer. Ethan announced new internal standards, clear consequences, transparent reviews. He credited the process, not the person. Ruth didn't mind. Recognition wasn't why she stayed. One afternoon, she received a letter. Handwritten. Claire Whitmore. Ruth read it once, then again. It wasn't an apology dressed up as defense. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest in a way Claire had never been before. "I didn't see you," the letter read, "and I'm learning what it cost me not to." Ruth folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. She didn't respond. Not because forgiveness was impossible, but because growth didn't require her validation. Months later, the Whitmore estate was put up for sale. Ethan moved into a smaller place closer to the city. He and Ruth crossed paths occasionally at work, respectful, professional, changed. They never spoke about the gala again. They didn't need to. On a quiet evening, Ruth returned home after a long day. She set her keys down, poured a cup of tea, and sat by the window. The city looked the same. But she didn't. She thought of her husband, of years spent choosing silence to survive, of the moment she decided survival wasn't enough. She had not been rescued. She had not been elevated by pity. She had been heard. And that made all the difference. The world hadn't flipped overnight. Inequality hadn't vanished. Power still moved unevenly. But somewhere, a system had paused long enough to listen. And in that pause, dignity had found its footing. Ruth closed her eyes, steady and certain. Tomorrow, the work would continue. But tonight, she allowed herself a quiet moment, not of victory, but of peace. Because the truth, once spoken, had done what it always does when it's finally respected. It stayed. This story isn't about a gala. It isn't about wealth, titles, or who stood where in the room. It's about how easily dignity is ignored when power feels comfortable. Ruth Johnson didn't change her life by raising her voice or demanding revenge. She didn't win because someone rescued her or handed her justice out of guilt. She changed the story because she refused to accept humiliation disguised as kindness, and because she chose truth over silence at the exact moment silence was expected. The lesson is simple but uncomfortable. How you treat people when you think they don't matter says everything about who you are. Claire believed status protected her. It didn't. Ethan believed good intentions were enough. They weren't. And a room full of powerful people believed silence meant agreement, until it didn't. Ruth reminds us that strength doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks calm. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like someone standing in a space they were never meant to survive and refusing to shrink. This story also teaches that accountability is not humiliation. It's correction. It's growth. It's the price of being taken seriously. No one here was perfect. That's what makes it real. Change didn't happen because someone was destroyed. It happened because someone listened and because someone else finally spoke. So the next time you're in a position of comfort, ask yourself, Who's invisible in this room? Who's being polite because they don't feel safe enough to be honest? And if the truth were spoken, would you be ready to hear it? Because dignity doesn't ask for permission, and respect should never be conditional. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone who stays quiet to survive, share it with them. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can give someone is the belief that their voice was never small to begin with.